So the RTX 5060 and 5070 model of the G14 are quite a bit different than the 5070 Ti and 5080 models. So I want to talk about that a little bit because depending on which one you choose could be a very different outcome for gaming performance, fan noise, temperatures, and more. So let's get into it. By the way, y'all are gonna love some of the videos I've got planned for 2026. All right, new laptop reviews, some bigger comparisons, a couple experiments, and honestly, the only way I'm keeping all that straight is with today's sponsor, Akiflow. So Akiflow's interface is really clean and it basically pulls everything together: Gmail, Slack, Outlook, and a bunch more. So you're not bouncing between 5 apps just trying to figure out what you're supposed to be doing next. So first of all, it's so easy and so quick to just set up your calendar with events, tasks, things like that. And when you hit the shortcut to bring up a new task, Control K or Command K on Mac, you have a few different options here. You can create a new task, a new calendar event, or you can talk to Aki, which is their little AI assistant. And it's actually pretty useful in this scenario. So you can use this to change things around on your calendar. It can sort of walk you through your ideal schedule. So I thought that was pretty cool. It's like having a little AI personal assistant. And by the way, making repeated events and, Teams meetings, Google meetings, super easy here. You can even duplicate tasks in just a couple clicks. One thing I really liked is the daily planning aspect. So this helps you sort of visualize and plan out your day, your week, your month, and so forth. You can even plan your shutdown time, when you need to dial it back and rest. And it gives you a nice little overview of what you're working on, how many hours you're looking at, things like that. So I thought it was cool to just be able to visualize, how much time am I working on something? What categories of tasks have I been working on? If you're someone who needs a little bit more organization in your schedule, especially if you're curious about where your time is being spent, then I highly recommend checking out Akiflow. I've got links in the description. So for me, I'm going to use this to, make a realistic schedule for myself because it's hard juggling multiple videos at once, all the research, the benchmarking, A/B testing, all that fun stuff. So again, thanks Akiflow for sponsoring this video. Now let's get back to it. All right, so let's start with the CPU differences because AMD kind of pulled a fast one here. If you get the RTX 5060 or 5070 G14, you are stuck with a 3-year-old CPU. And you're probably thinking, no, it's the Ryzen 9 270. What are you talking about? Yeah, that's the same CPU as last year's G14, which they just called it the Ryzen 9 8945HS. And the year before that, it was called the Ryzen 9 7940HS. These are all the same CPU. And it's not bad by any means. It's actually a very efficient CPU, but it's not new. The HX 370 is a completely different CPU using AMD's newest Zen 5 architecture, which makes it even more efficient and of course more powerful. And to demonstrate that, we really need to look at a power scaling chart because that actually shows you, how much better each CPU is at different wattage levels. Because when you're playing a game, the CPU can vary in wattage widely. Like it can be anywhere from 10 watts to like 40 watts, depending on the game. If you're playing something like Counter-Strike, it might use 40 watts or more. But if you're playing something really GPU heavy like Black Myth Wukong, it might only use like 12 watts. So keep in mind, the more efficient a CPU is, the less fan noise that you need to cool it because it doesn't need as much wattage to run effectively, which means less heat, more battery life. So it has a lot of good benefits from having a more efficient CPU. Everything below like 10 watts is where battery life is most important. So I'm using Cinebench R23 across various wattage levels here. And you can see, also sorry if I sound sick here, I have a little bit of a cold right now. So the way this graph works, you have all your wattage levels at the bottom. So lower wattage, you want to be scoring higher because that means more efficiency, more power at lower wattages. That's where we want most laptops to be. At 5 watts, the HX 370 is a little bit better. That usually means a little bit more battery life. But here it's not like a huge enough difference to be substantial because at 10 watts, they're about the same. But then 20 watts and beyond, the HX 370 really starts to surpass the Ryzen 9 270 by quite a bit. Plus, it has more cores. We're talking 12 cores versus 8 cores. So yeah, the multi-core performance is going to be higher, and this will lead to better performance in games that call for the CPU. So a game that might need like 30 watts out of the Ryzen 9 270 might only call for 20 watts out of the HX 370. So the good thing about that is now you've got like 10 watts of headroom for the GPU. And I think that's why they actually gave more GPU wattage for the 5070 Ti and 5080 models, because of that extra headroom given by the CPU. And I've also thrown in
chosen the Intel 285H here because it's kind of an in-between if you look at it, right? It's like sort of in between both of these CPUs. It's a very efficient CPU as well. So it's good to see Intel competing in that market, although they're not quite as efficient as AMD is. This is the CPU that you would find on the 2025 G16, which is a slight improvement over the 185H on the 2024 G16.
And that's not even taking into consideration the new Intel model with the new 386H, which is a 16 core CPU and should be about as efficient as the HX370 here, and possibly a little bit more efficient. However, it's not looking to be, like more powerful necessarily, maybe by a tiny margin, but efficiency really is where Intel is focusing on the 386H. So if you do pick up the 2026 model, just keep that in mind. It's going to be a lot closer to this HX370 here, maybe a little bit more power at that 5 to 20 watt range. But I'll leave a pinned note in the comments. And of course, I'm going to have a review when that one drops, so be sure to subscribe.
And single core performance also matters a lot for battery or single threaded programs. So that's where this comes in handy. You can see the HX370 is quite a bit better at 5 watts here. That's going to give you more snappiness on battery. Again, at 10 watts, they're about the same, but just like in the multi-core, the HX370 starts to pass the Ryzen 9 270 once you're beyond 10 watts. And the 285H is actually a little bit behind both until you hit 20 watts, and it actually starts to surpass both of them, but just barely. And some of you might remember the core-to-core latency for the Ryzen HX370 was pretty bad when it first came out. Luckily, AMD did improve that over time with BIOS updates, driver updates, but the older Ryzen 9 270 still has an advantage at 19 nanoseconds versus 62 nanoseconds. And this is really just because of the CPU architecture itself, but it's not a big enough gap to have any substantial difference in games or anything like that. So these CPU differences boil down to honestly about the same battery life. I was getting about 8.5 to 9 hours on both with an average discharge rate of about 7.5 watts. So really the HX370 is just going to be a little bit snappier. That's really going to be the only battery difference between the two.
Another thing to consider with the battery life is that new 2026 model with the Intel 386H. It is targeting efficiency, and from what we're seeing from this CPU, it's looking like it's going to have even more battery life than both of these. So if you're someone who really values battery life, you might want to wait for the 2026 model. However, just keep in mind it's probably going to be more expensive. Another thing too, the 5060 and 5070 G14s are actually a little bit thinner and a tiny bit lighter than the 5070 Ti and 5080 models, since those have a slight bump right here at the bottom of the laptop. Although in practice, you really wouldn't notice it. I mean, it's such a subtle difference that, if you gave me one or the other, then yeah, maybe right next to each other, I notice. But if I had this one for a few months and then I had the other one for a few months, I probably wouldn't even know.
So as far as fan noise goes, there's actually not much of a difference between the two. Both are extremely capable of like 0 decibels, fans off completely when you're just on battery, browsing, or just doing basic tasks. Even when you're plugged in, if you're just browsing the web, things like that. If you're in silent mode, the fans probably won't even come on. However, gaming, they're very similar. I actually thought there was going to be more of a difference here, but yeah, both get about the same fan noise, which makes me a little bit sad because that was actually my biggest complaint about the 2025 G14, because it's actually quite a bit louder than the 2023 and 2024 ones, which were pretty similar in their fan noise. So I have a few sound samples to compare this to the 5080 or 5070 Ti, since those both have the same fan noise, but also I'll have some sound samples from the 2025 G16, the 2024 G14, which had much lower fan noise, and the 2025 Legion 5, which also has very low fan noise. And that's where I would love to see Asus go in the future. I don't think we need blazing high fans. Like, yes, G-Helper can help you mitigate this by quite a bit if you're willing to go through the trial and error of setting up, fan curves to get your desirable level of performance and temperatures, but that does take some work. And I do have some recommended settings in my 2025 G14 review if you want like a lower fan noise balance setting on your G-Helper. But yeah, either way, I want to see the stock fans a little bit quieter, because the average person is not going to be editing fan curves in their manual mode or their G-Helpers. But yeah, anyways, here's the sound samples. As far as thermals go, I know a lot of people expect, RTX 5080, 5070 Ti, higher tier GPU is going to mean warmer, right? Well, that's actually not usually true because the RTX 5080, 5070 Ti have a larger die size, which means more surface area to keep it cooler. And that pretty much is the case here. If we look at some gameplay here, 114 watts on the GPU right here in this scene versus 98 watts on the 5060 model, yet the GPU is running 5 degrees cooler on the 5080 G14. Also keep in mind, the 5070 Ti, 5080 G14 have that little bump on the bottom, which definitely helps. Another thing to note here is the CPU is actually running a little bit warmer on the 5080 one, and I think that's just because of the combined wattage being higher. I think the CPU doesn't need as much wattage. You can see it's running at 14 watts versus about 19 to 20 watts on the 5060, which gives that GPU a little bit more headroom, like I was talking about earlier. But the HX 370 is running just a little bit warmer. Not bad at all though. And this is GPU bound, so this is, think of games like that are graphically demanding that are not pushing the CPU that hard. But if instead we're CPU bound, so think about games like Valorant, Counter-Strike, or if you're just running games at low settings, 1080p, stuff like that, then it's a little bit different. Again, the HX 370 is more efficient. It only needs about 32 watts versus over 50 watts needed on the Ryzen 9 270. So at this point, now the HX 370 is running cooler because of that greater efficiency. And we have a 20 watt difference here, yet we're still getting like higher 1% lows even on the 5080 model, which means we are getting better CPU performance out of it at a lower wattage at lower temperatures. Of course, usually pushing more wattage out does lead to the chassis being a little bit warmer. So if we're on battery though, it's really not much different. Both are very cool at about 28 to 30 degrees in the center and mid 20s on the sides. And even underneath, it's only about 28 to maybe like 33 max on the 5080 model, just runs a little bit warmer in the center and the bottom. But instead, if we're gaming, you can see that the 5080, 5070 Ti G14 is actually a decent bit warmer in the middle, about 6 degrees warmer than the 5060 or 5070 G14 here, which you can feel that for sure. I mean, it's not going to burn your hands or anything, but it's a bit toasty. I mean, the left and right of the keyboard, WASD, all that is fine. It's only in the mid to high 20s. But yeah, with that extra wattage does come a little bit of extra heat on the chassis itself.
And by the way, I don't really think the 2026 one is going to have much different temps than we're seeing here. So the GPU wattage does go a little higher on that one, but the chassis is basically the same with just very minor tweaks to the cooling. All right, now what if you're a creator? Is it worth it to get the higher tier models? Well, in some cases, yeah. So Photoshop, for example, you see the 5080 and 5070 Ti score really high here. That's primarily because Photoshop really benefits from that HX 370 CPU, whereas the 5060 with its older CPU is actually towards the bottom of the list, only scoring about 6200. All right, I'll put in the battery scores here. I don't have those right now. Well, what about video editing like Premiere Pro, which is a little bit more GPU heavy? The G14 scores around 11,000, just a little bit higher between the 5070 Ti and 5080, whereas the 5060 is still respectable around 9,700, which was actually better than I expected here. I think that's primarily because of the extra encoders that the 50 series GPUs have, which is why it's actually even pretty close to the 4090 G14 from 2023. In balance mode, the 5080 and 5070 Ti are still over 11K, 5060 still over 9K. Silent mode doesn't really lose much performance either, 8,900 now versus 9,500 on the 5080 or 5070 Ti. So if you use Premiere Pro and you're primarily going to be in silent mode, then really not much of a difference here. And what about DaVinci Resolve, which has a little bit of CPU reliance? Well, 5080 scores about 9,200 versus 7,400 on the RTX 5060. So not a huge difference, but pretty significant. In balance mode, we're still almost around 9,000 on the 5080 or 5070 Ti versus 7,200 on the 5060. Silent mode drops down 7,000 on the 5060. So very small drop there compared to about 8,300, 8,500 on the 5070 Ti or 5080. On battery, you're looking at close to 7,000 on the 5080 or 5070 Ti and pretty close on the 5060 as well, which is pretty surprising. But silent mode on battery does lose a little bit at 5,800 for the 5060, around 6,700 for the other two. This is one I also like to do USB-C power delivery just to show you what to expect from your GPU and CPU on USB-C, which would get you a score of over 7,000 on the 5080 or 5070 Ti or about 6,300 on the 5060, which is pretty respectable as well. Speaking of USB-C power delivery, Asus said that they would have a BIOS update out to fix the USB-C pass-through power delivery, which is where USB-C doesn't have to continually push power into the device if it is at its max capacity, but it sort of works, but it's kind of finicky. So every like 20 or 30 minutes, the device loses about 1% and it does have to recharge for a few minutes on USB-C. So I wouldn't really call that true pass-through, but it's something, I guess.
All right, let's talk about GPU differences. So one thing I want to get off the bat real quick is the GPU wattage. A lot of people get this wrong, especially a lot of reviewers. And I don't blame them because even Asus's website doesn't really allude to the fact that 5060 and 5070 G14 are actually running at 100 watts and not 90 watts. That is the actual max TGP. If you go to NVIDIA control panel, it shows you right there, and it is capable of hitting that wattage. Same thing with the 5070 Ti, 5080. A lot of people say those are 110 watt GPUs. They're actually 120 watts. So very impressive for a 14-inch device. I mean, even the 100 watts is impressive. So 120 is pretty crazy. And to benchmark gaming performance, we usually use 3D Mark Time Spy since it gives you a good look at how things are going to perform in games. So right off the bat, the 5060 obviously scores way lower here at 11,541 graphics score versus 17,600 on the 5080 model. That's a pretty big difference.
And I'm guessing on the Time Spy graphics score for the 2026 model, with having 10 more watts, it'll probably creep past 18,000 a bit.
Now, if we overclock them, 5080 can actually hit over 19,000, and while the 5060 can hit over 13,000. So these are actually very overclock friendly GPUs, which is really nice to see across all the 50 series. Compared to the 5070 Ti, I don't have an overclocked one of that one, but we are getting 15,900, so almost 16,000. So still a very big jump up from the 5060. And just comparing it to the 2024 G14 with the 4070, you can see they're about the same actually. So when you're thinking in terms of performance, the 5060 is about on par with a 4070 of similar wattage. I know the CPU scores are different here, but that's really just because of 3D Mark Time Spy. AMD's CPU scores are just all out of whack, so I don't really trust those. So we're really primarily looking at the graphics score, not even the combined score here. So how does that translate in games? Well, let's take a look. By the way, just a quick side note, if you do end up getting this laptop, it's an 1800p display, which actually isn't super beneficial. More pixels on a 14-inch display doesn't really make sense beyond 1600p. To actually get more FPS if you just turn your settings in games down to 1600p, and I can almost promise you, you will not notice a difference. You will just have more free FPS. So 1600p is how I would always have the display settings for this laptop in games. All right, so let's compare all of these in games to see how this really pans out.
And of course, keep in mind as I'm going through these gaming benchmarks that again, you have an extra 10 watts on the 2026 5080 G14 and 5070 Ti. So yeah, you're gonna get, I would guess, at least a few more FPS from that alone.
So Apex Legends, starting with that, since this is more of a CPU bound game, 236 FPS on the 5080 model, 217 on the 5070 Ti, and pretty far down there to 152 on the 5060. That is almost a 100 FPS drop on Apex Legends. This is one of the more drastic differences. So yeah, take that for what it is. But if we're instead in balance mode, we're hitting a little over 200 FPS on the 5080 and 5070 Ti, and about 134 on the 5060. You can see the RTX 4070 G14s are scoring a little higher here when typically they shouldn't be. So, I mean, that could just be some model to model variance or silicon lottery, honestly, or just driver updates, game updates over time. Black Myth Wukong is another very extreme example. This is just one of those games that shows you how 8 gigabytes of VRAM simply just isn't enough in some games at some settings. Like, yes, you do not have to play this game at the cinematic ray tracing ultra settings. Like, that's pretty ridiculous, not necessary, but it does show you how 8 gigabytes of VRAM is aging and will continue to age pretty poorly as games become more unoptimized or more graphically demanding. The 5080 G14 by comparison is hitting 64 FPS, so 3 times the frame rate. Even the 5070 Ti one is not far behind it at 58 FPS. In Black Ops 6, we see the 5080 G14 hitting about 100 FPS on the extreme preset with no upscaling. 5070 Ti about 10 FPS below that one, and the 5060 model about 25 FPS below that at around 64 FPS. So still pretty respectable for no upscaling here in this benchmark, but again, a pretty noticeable difference. Cyberpunk, I like to explore a lot of different presets just because it can offer so much variety into how your GPU and CPU are performing at basically different stress levels. At the Ray Tracing Ultra preset, we're hitting 66 FPS on the 5080, 61 FPS on the 5070 Ti, and 49 FPS on the 5060, which honestly isn't terrible. This actually puts it above the RTX 4070 G14. And if we're in balance mode, that drops down to 39 FPS versus 59 in the 5080, or if we're in silent mode, drops it down to 30 FPS on the 5060, 50 FPS on the 5080. So that's actually kind of a big benefit I want to point out here with the G14 5080 model is the ability to play some games in silent mode and still have respectable frame rates. So 50 FPS, right, for silent mode on the 5080 is 1 FPS higher than the 5060 model was getting at full turbo mode. Fans blazing. Also, another thing to keep in mind here is like the 5080 and 5060 being so far apart in benchmarks is not really really Asus's fault. This is NVIDIA creating such a huge divide between, you know, the 5060, especially when you get to the 5070 Ti level. It's such a huge jump up that they almost are trying to force people into that higher price bracket. So just keep that in mind as we're going through these benchmarks. So the Ultra preset, we're getting 92 FPS on the 5080, 85 FPS on the 5070 Ti, 72 FPS on the 5060, which is not a bad result. That actually puts it pretty far ahead of some RTX 4070 laptops. But ray tracing overdrive is another one where 8 gigabytes proves to not be enough. Like, it was basically a slideshow. I couldn't even get it to finish the benchmark. It was hitting about 15 FPS or so, whereas the RTX 5080 is doing great here at 79 FPS. Now, keep in mind, frame generation is active with this preset, but, you know, this is 2x frame gen, which is actually very smooth, and I don't even notice the input lag at that setting. So to have something playable at like the absolute maximum graphics that Cyberpunk can provide is crazy, you know? Even the 5070 Ti is giving you about 66 FPS. On the ray tracing overdrive preset, the 5060 can't even offer you that at all. 4K is possible. So 4K Ultra, for example, we're hitting 34 FPS. Not great, but not actually far behind 39 FPS on the 5070 Ti G14, which is kind of funny because the 5080 actually has a pretty good lead here at 48 FPS over all of them. And one more quick point I want to make about frame generation is, like, when you're on ultra high settings like this where VRAM is super limited, you can do 3x or 4x frame gen even on the RTX 5080 model, and it's actually pretty respectable. I mean, the 3x frame gen, I say, would probably be my max, but you can see here 109 FPS on RT overdrive, or 137 FPS if you're using 4x frame gen. Whereas again, you can't even finish the benchmark. You can't even run this setting at all on the 5060 G14, and very doubtful that you could actually do it on the 5070 model as well, just due to that 8 gigabytes of VRAM. Forza Horizon 5, 126 FPS on 5080, 121 on the 5070 Ti, not a big difference there. 85 FPS on the 5060. So you lose about 40 FPS in this game. That's a good little chunk. If instead you're in balanced or silent mode, balanced still gets you about 116 FPS on both the 5070 Ti or 5080 G14 versus 77 FPS on the 5060. Silent mode puts it at 66 FPS versus about 69 FPS on the 5080, or surprisingly a little bit higher, 77 FPS on the 5070 Ti. Not sure how that happened. And again, if we're in 4K, we're pushing about almost double the frame rate, going from 48 to 90 FPS on the 5080 G14, or 81 on the 5070 Ti. Helldivers 2, 127 FPS on 5080, you lose 10 FPS going to 5070 Ti, and then you lose 30 FPS going to the 5060 from there. So another 40 FPS gap between 5060 and 5080. Horizon Zero Dawn has some CPU reliance here, but still 130 FPS, you lose about 14 FPS down to the 5070 Ti, and again, almost 40 FPS going from 5080 to 5060. In balance mode, we're still at 126 FPS on the 5080 model versus about 43 less FPS on the 5060 model. And silent mode, the 5080 model does not do well here in silent mode, only 63 FPS versus 57 on the 5060. So not sure what happened there. It's another one I ran in 4K, 77 FPS on the 5080 versus 51 FPS on the 5060. Shadow of the Tomb Raider, 152 FPS versus a loss of 52 FPS going to 100 FPS flat on the 5060, with the 5070 Ti model being somewhere in between about 133. Balance mode, we're at 139 FPS versus 92, and silent mode 117 versus 58, so about double the FPS in silent mode. Another one we ran in 4K, 83 FPS versus 50 FPS on the 5060. However, it's very respectable on battery. The 5060, since it's much more of an efficient GPU, it actually scores 70 FPS on battery versus the 5080 only hitting about 64 FPS. So that is one of the few places it beats it, is simply that ultra low wattage gaming. Another great example of this is on USB-C power delivery. It has actually the highest scoring laptop I've recorded yet at 96 FPS versus 61 FPS on the RTX 5080 model. And that's because the 5080 and 5090 GPUs are just not that efficient, even the 5070 Ti. Now, I don't think that's how most people will be using this gaming laptop, but I thought it was interesting. So yeah, we're talking about average frame rates, you know, anywhere from like 40 to like 60% higher going from 5060 to 5080, or sometimes even higher than that, you know, almost double the frame rate. So yeah, it is a huge difference. And you're probably wondering, okay, what about the 5070? Well, keep in mind, the RTX 5070 is only about 10% better performing than the 5060. And it's also limited to 8 gigabytes of VRAM. So if anything, that's like the least bang for your buck GPU this generation. It will still be completely destroyed by a 5070 Ti or 5080, even when they're at that 120 watt level. And I'm not like trying to push people into buying a higher tier G14. Like obviously the RTX 5060 is a great value, especially when it's on sale. I've seen it as low as like $11.99, which is really good. But I mean, if you have the chance to pay, 60% more money for a 50 to 60% better performing machine, well, maybe it's worth it, depending on the price, the discounts, all that other stuff. So really the goal here was to dismiss the theories about people saying like, oh, 5070 Ti, 5080, it's not even worth it on the G14. That laptop is too small, it can't handle it, all this other stuff. But no, it's actually a really good performing machine. And there's a lot of use cases for having that extra performance, having the higher VRAM, being able to run games in silent mode at higher FPS than turbo mode on a lower tier GPU, or running, some ray tracing settings, frame generation, things that you can't even do on these lower tier models without them just crapping out, basically. So I'd argue there's definitely use cases, but brands have priced these higher tier GPUs at an insanely high level to where it's really only worth it if you find it on sale or open box, which you definitely can if you keep an eye on things like Best Buy, Micro Center, stores like that. You can find some pretty insane deals.
So yeah, there you have it, the 5060 and 5070 G14. If you can find them at the right price, I highly recommend it. It's a beautiful laptop. I feel like it, it has a little bit of something for everybody. To me, it's easily the most balanced 14-inch gaming laptop out there. Great specs with the Ryzen HX CPUs, even though the 5060 and 5070 have the lower tier AMD CPUs, which are still okay. They're still fine. Very manageable fans and temperatures, especially with the included software, Armory Crates, or G Helper, whichever one you decide to use. And yeah, there's a huge performance gap between this and the 5070 Ti model. So that's just something to keep in mind depending on which one you go with. I don't think you're going to be upset either way. It's just, the 5060 and 5070s will show their age a little bit sooner with newer games that are coming out and demanding more VRAM, things like that. And that goes for all gaming laptops. That's just how it's going to be, unfortunately, with the way that NVIDIA set everybody up with 2025 laptops. So if you decide you want one for yourself or any other G14 model, I have links in the description that helps support the channel. So definitely recommend it if you use one of those. And of course, it always supports the channel too when you subscribe, like, and comment. So be sure to do that. And thank you so much, guys, for watching. I will see you in the next one.